Okay, so now we're going to move on to historical myths. And for this slide, we're going to talk about a couple of the important stories or narratives within Judaism and also the importance of storytelling within Judaism. So the first point that I have here is just to know that for Judaism, history is sacred. So the sanctity of history, because of the type of God that Jews worship. So this is a God, this is a deity, right, who creates the entire world and has a special relationship with his people. So this is a God who is concerned about his people. And remember, part of that covenant was to protect them and continue that special relationship. So what happens to the Jewish people is seen as an act of God. Because God is having a continued hand in history. God has a continued interest in history. So the history of the Jewish people is very important because God is at work in their history. Right? If good things happen to them, it's because God is rewarding them. If bad things happen to them, it could be because God is punishing them. Because this covenantal relationship evolves to take on these characteristics. Right? That God is protecting them and looking out for them, but God also wants them to follow his law, to obey him and to worship him. So he rewards or punishes them as they live up to their side of the covenantal agreement. And the second point that I have here says to tell the story, and this is something that Prothero talks about, that it's not just important to remember these stories. History is not just important in a text. It's important for Jewish people to tell this story. So during this slide, we'll talk a bit more about the persecution of the Jewish people. This is a very important theme and narrative throughout Jewish history, is that the Jewish people, in every place that they have lived, other than a very brief period of time when they controlled the land of Israel in the past, and really since 1948 within the contemporary nation of Israel, Jews have lived as a minority in another land, right? God first called Abram out of his homeland. He said, "Leave your home and follow me." So Jews have been searching for their homeland, and they have been a religious and ethnic minority wherever they have lived. And despite the time and the place in the world, minorities tend to be persecuted for being different and for being a small group. They tend to become a target because of their minority status. And this has happened to the Jewish people. So telling the story of who they are, telling the story of their persecution and their overcoming of difficult challenges is a sacred task within Judaism. So history is sacred as an act of memory, that the Jewish people need to remember their history and their historical myths, and they remember it by continuing to tell the story. That's how you keep a story alive within a community, is to tell it through ritual, tell it through holidays, tell it through story, and as we'll see, that's something that is woven into Jewish life, into their holidays and their rituals, is telling their story. So that just kind of sets the stage for some of the other stories that we're going to talk about within this slide. So the first story, which is a very important story, is the story of the Exodus. And this was a part of your reading from the World's Wisdom text. So you're reading excerpts from the Exodus story. And this story belongs to that first phase of Judaism that we talked about, when they were wandering nomads. And they really weren't even called Jews yet. They were called the Hebrews, or the Hebrew people, or the Hebrew tribe. The word Jew doesn't come, or Jewish doesn't come until later. We'll talk about after the Jewish people have moved into the land of Israel for the first time. So many of you may be familiar with this story already. If you grew up in a Jewish or Christian background, you may have already read this story. But it's a story of what happens to the Hebrew people while they're living in Egypt. So for a period of time, they are living, again, as an ethnic and religious minority in the country of Egypt. And this is, ancient Egypt, so the ruler of Egypt is the Pharaoh. And the Hebrew people are actually slaves at this time. They are not treated very well. They are abused, misused, exploited for their labor, and they are not happy with these conditions. Obviously, so God calls someone, calls a leader of the Jewish people to lead them out of this slavery. And that person's name is Moses. And again, you read part of this story in your text. And Moses has this interesting status in the society at the time because he is Jewish, but he was raised within Egyptian society. So he kind of has, one foot in each world. So he's a good candidate to be the leader of the Jewish people who will lead them out of Egypt, because he goes about this task by asking the Pharaoh to release the Jewish people. He goes to the Pharaoh several times, asks the Pharaoh each time to please let his people go, and each time the Pharaoh says no. So this happens at first 9 different times, and each time that it happens, the Pharaoh says no, and then God sends a plague upon the Egyptian people. There are various plagues. There's the locusts and the rivers turning red with blood. So there's lots of different these sort of catastrophic and very dramatic things happen to the Egyptian people and the Egyptian land to demonstrate that God is powerful, and that God is going to protect his people. So this happens 9 times, and then Moses goes back to the Pharaoh a 10th time. Asks one more time, will you let my people go? Pharaoh says no. And then God sends the final plague, the 10th plague. And this plague is actually to kill the firstborn son of every Egyptian household. So when God tells Moses that he's going to do this, he gives Moses special instructions for the Jewish people to follow. And he tells them, this is what's going to happen. The angel of death, I'm going to send the angel of death throughout Egypt, and the angel of death is going to kill the firstborn son in every family or in every household. But what you guys need to do is you need to slaughter a lamb and take the blood and wipe it like above your doorpost, so like right in the entrance of your house. And so when the angel of death sees that blood, he'll know not to kill the firstborn son in that house, that this is a Jewish or Hebrew household, and so not to do that. So this idea of the angel of death passing over every Jewish home is the basis of the holiday Passover, the Jewish holiday Passover, which you've probably heard of before. So we'll talk more about the rituals that are done during Passover, but just know that Passover is the telling of the Exodus story. So this happens, the angel of death comes through the land of Egypt, kills all the firstborn males, and this finally changes Pharaoh's mind. Pharaoh sees, that the God of the Jewish people is a very powerful God. He doesn't want any more, tragedies to happen to his people. So he says, okay, yes, you can go. The Jewish people leave. Moses tells everybody, all right, we got to go. Let's leave. They go out into the desert. They're leaving Egypt. But for some reason, Pharaoh changes his mind again, and he says, no, I don't want these people to leave. I want them to come back and to continue being my slaves. So he sends his army, he goes with his army out into the desert to pursue them. And this is when the Jewish people make their dramatic escape, a story you've probably heard of before. Moses comes to the Red Sea, and the Egyptian army is sort of closing in on them, behind them. Through a miraculous act of God, he's able to part the waters of the sea. The Jewish people go through, they cross through the sea, and the waters are still parted. Pharaoh and his army then follow them. They follow into the sea with the waters still parted. And right then the waters come crashing back down, and they destroy the Egyptian army and the Pharaoh with it. So this story is very important for the Jewish people. It is a story of going from slavery to liberation. So that's the word that I have here. So for the Jewish people, the Exodus story is one of great hope. And it's one of a confirmation of the protection and special relationship with God, right? That God, when the Jewish people are suffering, God will come to their aid. God will help them. He will save them as he did in the Exodus story. So it sort of becomes this archetypal story of going from a point of bondage or slavery into liberation. So it tells the story of this happening once, but it becomes sort of a narrative pattern that the Jewish people will continue to suffer. And throughout history, they have been a persecuted minority. It's called anti-Semitism, is an attitude or actions against the Jewish people. And this is something that has existed in every country that Jewish people have lived in, unfortunately. And it's something that continues to this day. So the Exodus story becomes an especially sacred story to the Jews because it gives them hope in these times of persecution, right? That even when things seem very, very bad, when the persecution seems incredibly intense, the Exodus story reminds the Jewish people that they will one day be liberated from this, that God will hear their cries and will care for them and set them free from whatever form of slavery, persecution, or bondage that they are in. So the Exodus story becomes a very important archetypal story, one of the two main archetypal stories within the Jewish tradition, and that's why it's important to tell the story, right? Because the story doesn't happen just once; it has continued to happen throughout history. The Jewish people are suffering. God hears them, and God helps them, and this continues in a pattern throughout history. So the Exodus story is an incredibly important one for the Jewish people. It's retold and celebrated every year during the Passover holiday, which we'll talk about when we get to rituals. Then I have down here the second sort of major story or period of time in Jewish history, which is called the Temple period. And this is the period of time when either the first or second temple was standing. So after the story of the Exodus, the Jewish people, they are free. They go out into the desert. They actually wander around the desert for a period of 40 years. And then they finally are led into that promised land. So the original land that God promised to Abram, the Jewish people don't see that until many years after the Exodus story. So, Abraham is long gone at this point, but God finally fulfills that promise and he delivers the promised land to them. So they enter what's originally known as the land of Canaan, and they conquer that land, and it becomes Israel. It actually divides up into two kingdoms. There's Israel in the north and Judah in the south, and as Prothero mentions, that kingdom of Judah is the last remaining kingdom of the two, and that's where the term Judaism and Jewish comes from, is from the southern kingdom of Judah. So what happens is the Jewish people, they get this land, they conquer this land, they are in control of this land. When they're there, they build a temple. The first temple is built by Solomon somewhere around the year 1000 BCE. That temple lasts until 586 BCE. You don't need to know the exact dates. That temple lasts until, we'll just say, the 6th century BCE, and when it's destroyed by the by the Babylonians. That's who it's destroyed by. It's destroyed by the Babylonian Empire, and that initiates a period of time called the Babylonian Exile. So first temple is built by Solomon. It lasts for about 500 years. It's destroyed by the Babylonians when the Babylonians come and conquer that southern kingdom of Judah. So that period of time, other than the present day with the nation of Israel, is the only time that the Jewish people were in control of their promised land. And they had a temple there, they had a central place of worship, but that's all destroyed by the Babylonians. The Babylonians come in and conquer the whole area and destroy the temple. They also end up killing a large majority of the Jewish people. Those that they let live, they end up kidnapping and taking them back to Babylon, which is near present-day Iraq. This period of time is known as the Babylonian Exile. This lasted from 586 to 536 BCE, so it was only a 50-year period. But it ends up being a really important period of time in Jewish history because this is when the Torah starts to be formulated. The Jewish people have had their land at this point. They have been given their promised land. They have built a temple where they believe the Spirit of God resides, that He actually lives there. And then it's all destroyed, it's all taken away. So, this is a time of great mourning and grieving and lamentation and missing that land, right? Missing being in the presence where the Spirit of God lives, the presence of God. So this is when the Jewish people start to question, well, if we can't be in our land, how can we still, continue to live out our religious tradition? So they start to write their stories down. The Torah takes a very long time to be written, but this is a crucial time when a lot of those stories are written down. A lot of them start to be compilated, which ends up becoming the Torah. So it's that first sort of central question of, well, if we can't be near the land, how do we stay close to our tradition? We do it by writing down our hope for the land, our love for God, our stories about God, and that's a way that we can feel close to the Spirit of God or the presence of God, even if we're not near God's promised land or the temple that we built for God. So this 50-year period is very important. But eventually the Babylonians are conquered by the Persians, and the Persians are much nicer to the Jewish people. The Emperor Cyrus is the Persian emperor, and he lets the Jews go back. He says, you know what? If you guys want to return to your land, you can do that, and you can even rebuild your temple if you want to. So many Jewish people do. They go back and they build a second temple. The second temple is built in 515 BCE, and that lasts until 70 CE. So there's a first temple, and then there's a second temple. The second temple is destroyed in 70 CE by the Romans. And there's never been a third temple, so there's never been another temple built after that. But this period of time when the first or second temple stands is called the Temple period. This is when Judaism is focused on a single building, right? We talked about those three phases of Jewish history. So temple-based Judaism can only exist when there is a temple, because the belief is that that's where God lived. When the temple was there, the Spirit of God resided in the temple. So if you wanted to practice the Jewish religion, if you wanted to be close to God, you actually went to the temple. You went to this place where God lived. The image behind me that you can see the Jewish men praying up against this wall, this is called the Western Wall or the Wailing Wall, and it is the last remaining wall of the Second Temple. So the Second Temple was destroyed in 70 CE by the Romans, but one wall was left standing, and that wall is still there today. For Jews, this is the most sacred place in the world. If Jews do not live in Israel, if they can, will travel to Israel in order to go pray at this wall. And that's what the gentlemen are doing behind me. It is considered especially sacred, right? It's called now the Wailing Wall, not like, a whale in the sea, but wailing like crying, because the wall itself has come to be a symbol of this history of persecution. All the Jewish suffering that has existed for centuries, for thousands of years. Because this was the temple, it was destroyed, it's never been rebuilt. It's come to symbolize all the sadness and suffering that the Jewish people have gone through. So when Jewish men and women go there to pray, they oftentimes are overcome by emotion, and they end up wailing, they end up crying. I've been there many years ago now, but it's a very emotional experience to be there. You can see that this is a very powerful feeling for the Jewish people to come and to touch the wall and to pray at the wall. And it actually literally has become the Wailing Wall, or the place of, a place that holds the hopes and sadnesses of the Jewish people, because actually one of the traditions that people do when they go to the wall is they write a little prayer on a piece of paper, like a little piece of paper. So they write their prayer, their hope, for the future, the hope for something better in the future. They roll it up into a little scroll type thing, and they stick it in the cracks, and you can kind of see it in the picture behind me. So the wall itself actually is now completely filled with these little pieces of paper. So it's the wall itself, in a sense, is also now built of Jewish hopes and prayers. Although anyone can do this. If you go visit the wall, you can write. You can write on a scroll and put it into the wall. So this is a very important item and a very important time for the Jewish people when they had this single temple, this central location for their religious tradition. Right? We said now that there's no more temple, the focus of the Jewish religion is the book, is the Torah. That becomes the replacement for a single building. Okay, then the last thing I have here, we've kind of talked about this already, but this continued theme of persecution, as well as what Prothero calls exile and return. So the Exodus becomes this archetypal narrative of going from slavery to liberation, from persecution to freedom, or persecution to justice. But the idea of the destruction of the temple becomes the archetypal narrative of exile and return. Because remember, we talked about this in one of the earlier slides, but once the second temple is destroyed, many Jews do not feel safe in their land anymore, even though this is their promised land that God promised to them, and they consider this land sacred. The destruction of the temple was part of a larger crackdown on the Jewish people. So many Jews left that area. This began the time known as the diaspora, right, where Jewish people left Israel and moved all over the world. So the idea is that Jews all over the world are living in exile, and they hope one day to return to their homeland. For many Jews, that became literally true when the creation of the state of Israel happened, and they were able to return. The getting citizenship in Israel for Jewish people is actually called the right of return. That Jewish people have the right to return to their homeland. That's the name of the policy within the country of Israel. So this notion of exile and return also becomes really this framing narrative, or this archetypal narrative that continues, right? It's not just that they were exiled once and will return once. It's that Jewish people are exiled again and again and hope for a return back to God, a return back to traditions, back to the community. So it takes on this larger symbolic meaning for the Jewish people. And that's why it's important to tell these stories, right? To keep this memory alive, because it happened in history, but it continues to happen, and it will happen again. And that's how we understand what we go through when we have, further suffering and further disadvantages and things like that. Okay, so that's all we have for historical myths. And then next we're going to move on to myths of ending.